people talking about, well, I use ChatGPT, I use Codex, I use Kimi 2.6. I don't even know what Kimi's up to, 3.6. The model is really only one part of the flow. It's just one piece of the operating layer. And to really get these efficiency gains and the fantastic outputs that are possible with these wonderful new tools, you need to get this architecture, this ecosystem built right as well. Welcome aboard, everybody. It's a beautiful day here in the sunny coast. Welcome to another work seminar. This one is on the AI operating layer architecture. This is the first of a series of 4 webinars that I'm going to run, basically running through the primary building blocks of what you should be thinking about when you're building your AI machine. The 4 fundamental layers, if you like. First one is architecture. Second one will be context. Third one will be the brain, the durable knowledge the business needs to run on. And then the 4th one is skills. Skills is actually where everybody jumps to first, but really you've got to get these foundations right. If you get your architecture, your brain set up, your context firing, then the skills are the cherry on top. They're the sexy ones. They're the ones that everybody talks about. But these are the 4 fundamental pieces that you'll need to get in place in order to get your AI rocket ship blasting off and really get some of these efficiencies and some of these gains that is possible with these wonderful new machines. So the architecture is the first piece that you should be thinking about and the first piece that you should be building before you do anything else. And that's why we're starting here. Makes sense? Okay, let's get after it. So at its very simplest form, AI architecture, you can think about it as a structured workspace inside which everything lives, and the AI, whatever model that you're using, whether you're Claude Build, you're a Chat, or Grok has just come out firing in the last couple of days, whatever you're doing, it needs to live inside of a kind of a structured workspace that tells the model where to find things, how to get access to things, where to store things, what to run on, what do you like, how do you like to operate, what's your brand, things like that. So at its very simplest form, AI architecture, you can think of it like a series of folders. So for those of us who are old enough to have lived through the 90s using Windows computers, our time has come because here we are once again using folders, and having a structured approach with folders is really super helpful in this new world that we're living in. The good news now, of course, is that like everything else, AI can build that folder structure for you. But this is just a very small snapshot of what that folder architecture might look like. You've got your root folder, your company root folder, which has all of the all of the rules and the context that is persistent no matter what you're working on. So this can be things like, what's your company brand? What's your logo? What's your fonts? All of your brand identity. What's your voice? Who's your ICP? What are you working on? What's your pricing? Everything, all of the information that applies to everything that you do should be stored in this folder. And then as a subfolder in there, you'll have different project folders. And again, for me, I just have this sitting in, I started off with just sitting it in iCloud, and I have a very simple folder tree. It's a bit more complicated now, but you can build this up to be a more complex database. But again, we're going to start right here at the very beginning. So your project folder is where all of the specific information lives with regards to that specific project. Now, that project can be something that you're building internally. It could be a product. It could be a feature. It could be a client. It really depends on your business and how you're set up and what's important for that business. At the top of both the root folder and the projects folder, there's in projects there's Agents MD and Claude MD. If you haven't come across those before, they're basically the guide for Claude or Codex. I'm going to refer to those two pretty equally today because your architecture should be built that you can work with any model. Agents is what Codex uses. Claude MD is what Claude uses, and they're really just the high-level folder that tells it everything about this project, or in the company root, everything about that company. You can see over here in the roots folder, clearly this image was made by Codex because it only included the Agents MD file, but that could be a Claude MD file as well. My setup, because I use both Claude and Codex, I actually switch back and forth between the two. So I have a canonical set that can be either. But you can see that the kinds of information that you will store in this project folder is details that tells your AI what's important for this particular project. So it could be things like history, what are the assets, and assets can be anything of a digital nature. It could be a PDF, it could be a PowerPoint, it could be an Excel, it could be 10,000 word go-to-market playbook, whatever it is that you're doing. It's got a history in there, so you know what's happened and when it happened, and almost like a journal log. You've got things like decisions that were made, and hopefully you've got some information about why those decisions were made. And then you have tasks. So again, when you're thinking about the ideal architecture for your setup, there are a million different ways that you can do this. So I'm trying to keep this as not generic, but as general as possible. And this is obviously based on how I set up my existing systems for works, but also when we're setting up for clients as well. Okay, so tasks is a file that's associated, TaskMD sitting in this folder just with this project. But the good thing about having your architecture set up correctly is that when each project has a task file, you can roll that up into a global task file that can sit here in the root folder, and that gives you a global view of tasks, and that's very useful when you are using the AI to do things like, what am I working on today? Task management, time management, things like that. And then the other major piece of the architecture here is the connectors to the live sources. So connectors and the frontier models make it very, very easy to hit connectors these days. You literally just click a button and it can connect to your Gmail, to your CRM, whether it's HubSpot, ADIO, connect to your calendar, connect to Google Drive, wherever you store your documents. So these connectors mean that your AI, your agent, your system has access to these data sources and can pull them in. I can either read from them or write to them as required, and it also enables it to pull in the right context at the right time. So the phrase that we use here is minimal viable context, because what you don't want is to dump all of this knowledge, all of this context into your folder and just have the AI overwhelmed with everything that's going on there. Okay, now one of the things that architecture is designed to solve is the blank request, the repeated briefing tax. So when ChatGPT first dropped, you're using this amazing little app that came out and it had the sum of all human knowledge on it. You ask a question and it knew the answer somehow, and it was amazing. Fantastic, but every time you start a new chat, you basically have to start again. There's no repeated context, there's no memory, there's no history. Now, obviously, when you are doing knowledge work, and again, to call out, the focus of the webinar today is very much on knowledge work. So I'm not going to talk about agentic software development. That's well out of my wheelhouse. This is all knowledge work. Everybody who sits outside the engineering team. So when you're doing that, you don't want to have to explain every time you use your AI what the company is, what your brand voice is, who your ICP is, what are the objection handling. You don't want to do that. You don't want to explain who the client is and what the history is. You don't want to explain the task every single time. So that is what the architecture is designed to solve. Because every business already has an operating layer. Now, whether or not that's codified or not, there are rules, there are processes. Some of it is codified, some of it lives in existing systems, but the architecture for your AI systems needs to make that invisible context, needs to make it visible for the machine so it can pull into it. So rules about how the work should be done. What happens when you sign a contract? Where does that go next? Who's in charge of onboarding? Who do you need to notify? Where does current information come from? So the sources. If you want to know the stage of a deal, where should you go for that? If you want to check to see if an invoice has been paid, what system do you look in to see that? And then the handoffs as well, because ultimately you want your AI to produce something. And most of the time in knowledge work, there will be a human in the loop there to check where that comes from before you send it out to a client or send it out to the world. So that's the three kind of areas that you need to make visible to your AI system: the rules, the sources, and the handoffs, where results go and where changes go. So what does that look like? So architecture makes that context usable by AI. It gives that explicit it gives it an explicit structure so it can find that operating knowledge, that business layer, that context that it needs to run. And the three main ones that you can think about here, as we saw on the diagram before, you've got your root index, which is where any persistent context, any rules that need to be in there that will remain true for the whole, for everything that you're doing in the company, live in there. Where to find things, basically. You can think of it like an index. Project context. So what matters for this client? Are they a top tier client? Do they have a bad experience? Have we got them back from churning? Are they a low value client? We shouldn't spend too much time, and there are no low value clients, of course. But some of them are just more valued than others. And then, those live connections that we spoke about, which is really about what is your source of truth? Where do the facts live in the business? And where do we get the outputs? If we're asking, our AI to create a deck, make a marketing plan, create a spreadsheet, where does that go? Where does that live from here? And, one of the things that AI is very good at is taking knowledge or input in one form and producing multiple formats of that. So you can push that out into multiple channels. So your architecture needs to control and inform all of these layers. Let's have a look at the index. So your index tells AI where to look for everything, as well as the kind of persistent context you have in there, like things like your about me, your brand voice, and things like, your ICP, depending on the business. It also tells AI where to look to find things that live in your existing systems. So it could be something like, what's the current deal stage? Great, go and have a look in ADIO. It'll tell you where this deal is at, who's involved with it, what's the previous correspondence that's been there. Okay, I'm doing a proposal. What pricing can we offer to this client? Okay, so go and have a look at your pricing document, which has been approved and sits somewhere and you're not allowed to touch it, and that's the only price or price range you can offer to clients. What history do we have? Go and have a look at emails and see the previous emails that we have. Go and have a look at the client folder and see what QBRs we've done, how long we've been working with this client, what's been going on before this, and when's the next time we're catching up? What's the next commitment? So the index, and it's very important to think about this as more of a guide, more as a map, rather than our filing cabinet. Because what you don't want to do is get all the data from the CRM and dump it into your company brain, or dump it into the AI, because that will blow up your context window when you're talking to it. So it's very important that this index is really just pointing your AI systems to the right source so it knows where to look for. And again, all of this is generally stored in your root folder, the top folder, stored at the top of the workspace, so it's always available for your machine. It's a pretty common trope at the moment to hear things like, we don't need a CRM, we're going to vibe code our own, we're going to do away with all of it. It just lives in the machine somewhere. Now, I have been known to say a few things very close to that, but I'm a firm believer that you will absolutely need your source of truth to remain. And AI is almost like the operating layer that sits in above that and pulling from your CRM. Now, your CRM may not have the bells and whistles that it used to do. Shout out to HubSpot, which loves to get you to pay for an extra module every time you want it to do something, because now you've got this incredible machinery that sits on top of your shared assets and sits on top of this architecture and allows you to do things like review your clients. It allows you to check the current status. You can have a look at, working files. So a shared drive can be anything from Google Drive, OneDrive, SharePoint, anything where you store your working documents on a day-to-day basis. How you communicate both with your teammates and your clients, whether that's Slack, email, WhatsApp, all of that can be made available to your machinery as well. And your calendar, generally, like most of us, the calendar rules us and will tell you where you need to be and what you're doing. So the brain, if you think about the brain, and we're going to talk about this in a later seminar, but the brain, again, is the lean, durable knowledge layer that sits in there. Now, it's very dynamic and it gets updated all the time. But again, it points to live records, such as these sources of truth via the connectors, rather than copying all of that data and dumping it in there. That doesn't mean you can't run your AI over this data and get some amazing insights. I think that's a very powerful use, and giving AI access to your historical data is 100% something that usually drives some really interesting insights. And I've seen that time and again in the last couple of years. And a particular application could be, if I'm talking to a founder and talking to the founder about how well you know your market or how well you know your clients. They're like, yep, 100%, I know my ICP. They look like this. I feel very strongly about that. And then when you analyze historical client data, you say, actually, Your top performing segment is here, and these ones are the most profitable, and these ones come on board quicker. Giving access to the AIs and whatever these sources of truth are is 100% the right way to go, but you just need to get the architecture set up so it's accessing it and not duplicating it. Okay, so what does that all look like? So the whole point of the architecture is to provide to your model, whatever you're using, whatever AI is your preferred daemon of choice, it provides it a really focused, purpose-built brief. And to do that, it's taking in all of these layers of context that we spoke about it already. So you've got the company layer, what's our offer? Who's the audience? What are the rules about engaging with it? We've got the next layer down is the account or the project that you happen to be working on. Because it's not always an external focused task that you're giving to the machines. It could be building an internal tool. So, what's the current status of that project? What's the history? What's the why? What's the PRD? Anything that you've put in there. Next layer down is your own about me type documentation. So whenever you're setting up with a new AI tool for the very first time, one of the very first things you should do as you're setting up this architecture is the about me layer, as it's often referred to. And that is the simplest way to do that is literally just tell the AI to ask you questions until it knows enough about how you like to work, how you like to communicate, what channels that you're in, how do you like to message, what social media do you use, what's driving you, what keeps you up at night, what do you hate. The more information that you can give it at this point, the more targeted, the better the outcomes will be. So that's the person layer. And then this job. And so this can be things like the latest inputs. You could be uploading a file. You could be giving it a command in your however you're supplying the machine. And by supplying, I mean, are you typing it in? Is it a chatbot? Are you giving it voice notes? Are you using the new extremely wonderful Codex voice commands? And if you haven't been using Codex with voice, Codex is ChatGPT for work. That's like a month old. I need to upgrade my knowledge bank on that. So ChatGPT for work has voice control. It will change your life. You can simply hit voice control. You can talk to it. It can spin up sub-agents. It can control your computer. It can start doing things. It can run skills and workflows that you built before. It really is the next step jump. But the take-home message there is there are multiple ways that you can feed in a prompt or a brief to your AI, text, voice notes, active voice control. The other big one that's really helpful that I find really helpful is snapshots. So whenever I run into a technical problem, and I did this multiple times setting up the streaming on Riverside and YouTube today, I took a snapshot of what I was looking at, took a screenshot, and then just loaded that I was using Codex, ChatGPT for work. I loaded that into ChatGPT for work and said, hey, can you fix this? Is this right? My prompting is not, I'm trying to think of the polite way to describe this. My prompting is not prompt engineering. I think there was a time probably 12 months ago before the models were as sophisticated as they are now, when everybody was learning to write these incredibly detailed, structured prompts and framing it and giving it a personality and saying, you're the world's best marketer. You don't need to do that anymore. No shade if you're doing it or you're still doing it, it still works, but you really don't need to. There's a phrase that I really like from an AI operator called Claire Vaux. She calls it the Yappers API, which is basically just pick it up, hit Mac Whisper, whatever it is that you're using, and just talk to it. Leave a long rambling note. In fact, it even does better on long rambling notes than short ones. Okay, so I'm getting a little bit distracted by that. Let's get back on topic. So the whole point of this job is that you now provide to your machine, to your AI, a very focused, purpose-built brief that's got all the context that it needs, but no more than that. That's that minimal viable context piece that I spoke about before, because the more targeted you get this, the better the outcomes will be, the less hallucinations you will get, and the less tokens you will burn, which is very important. So this is just really the input. So it's basically assembling that from all of the different pieces of the architecture that we've run through. It's pulling that all together and creating this purpose-built brief, if you like. So there's a phrase called progressive context, and progressive context means you are just exposing to your AI just enough knowledge, context, that it needs to do the job and no more. And that's what you really want to be doing. That's when you get the best outcomes. And that's really a lot of what architecture is built to solve. So architecture also needs to include things like rules around conflicts. Because particularly as you've been using this for a while, your knowledge base, your knowledge bank gets messy. And if you're an existing organization, knowledge is already messy. Shout out to Neil Mann if he's watching this, because he'll probably faint when he sees me doing this. He's got a wonderful product called Known, N-O-A-N, that solves the messiness very well. But if you're not using Known and you have, like most of us, you have your company knowledge in various different drives. You have it in PDFs, you have it in Excels, you have it in seven different platforms. There can be conflict, and there will be conflict. And so you need to build some rules into your architecture so that your AI can understand exactly if there's a conflict in price, which is the correct answer. Usually it's the most relevant one, but not always. Usually it's the CEO, but not always. And AI is very good at figuring out those kind of fuzzy, messy little decisions in the middle. So it's very good at that, but you do need to give it the structure. You do need to give it some guidance. And in the example here, it runs through, it will check the usual source first. So if the AI has been instructed as part of the brief to pull in, are they an existing client? It'll go to the CRM. And so are they? No, they're only in proposal. But then if there's an email that says, hey, yes, here's the signed contract, we're ready to go, there's two things there. One, you need to update the CRM, fix the source, and then two, that's going to take precedence. So you need to be thinking about giving your AI guidance around how to deal with conflicts in information. So let's talk about a worked example, and this is one, pulling it all together, this is one that I use a lot. Generally, whenever I finish a call, could be a sales call, an internal call, product call, team call, whenever I finish that, I try and jump straight away into my machine, usually Codex or Claude, and say, hey, I just had a sales call, let's call them Acme, I've just had a sales call with Acme, went really well, can you pull a transcript, build a proposal, draft a follow-up email based on what we discussed and put that into drafts. So that's like one, that'll be an audio. I'll prompt it exactly like that. And then the machine, because I've built this architecture, it knows where to look to pull all that context, all that information, where to find the recording. So I use Granola. There's a million different call recorders. It doesn't really matter which one you use. It'll pull the transcript. It'll have a look at the attendees from calendar. It will see what was discussed in there and what we agreed. Then it'll go to the CRM and pull Acme. It'll know the context of this client, where the deal stage is at, what we've discussed previously, where they're at. It'll start to put together an offer. The offer document is, what is the pricing for our offer? What is the canonical description of our services? Then it'll start to pull all this together. It'll have a look at the proposal library where we've got templates. It's obviously pulling in brand guidance, so it's got the right font. It knows that we do proposals in HTML and we'll send them as a link, and it will check my inbox. Usually for existing clients, that's done only in email. But if I'm talking about new prospects, it will check LinkedIn and WhatsApp as well. So it pulls all of that together, and the architecture assembles this one focused brief. So everything that we've spoken about so far hasn't touched really the output, what the AI makes for you. All of this has been about assembling the right architecture, the right structures, giving it the right tools so that it can create this one awesome brief for you. So the proposal is the output. And then once you have that kind of output, and again, in this example, we're going to call it, it's a sales proposal, it will create that draft proposal, save it in the project files. So now in your pre-existing folder structure, every time I have a new client come on board, my machine creates the folder structure, which will be call transcripts, proposal, signed contract, or weekly meetings. Whatever your structure is, it can create that. And then your machine knows to save a draft sales proposal in the proposal folder. So away it goes. If the status of the deal has changed, it will go and update the CRM. If there's a follow-up meeting discussed, it will go and add it to calendar. There's a follow-up email. I usually get it to put it into drafts. And so if I was to do a follow-up task and say, hey, chase this proposal, they haven't come back and agreed yet, Your machine now has the context, it has the updated records to know what has actually happened, and so it's starting from there. It's not starting from scratch. So at a very high level, we've kind of go down in the weeds there. At a very high level, to come back up to the 10,000 foot view, architecture carries a job from the request, when you first put it in there, that's driven by the human. Architecture helps build the brief, your model or multiple models, if you do a kind of cross review or red teaming or anything like that. The AI does the work, and then it usually, in knowledge work, usually there's another step of human in the loop reviewing it and approving it before it sends out. And then you've got the tools and records which will keep track of everything that's been done, update any necessary files as they go. So the call out from this slide is really just to realize that the model, people talking about, well, I use ChatGPT, I use Codex, I use Kimi 2.6. I don't even know what Kimi's up to, 3.6. The model is really only one part of the flow. It's just one piece of the operating layer. And to really get these efficiency gains and the fantastic outputs that are possible with these wonderful new tools, you need to get this architecture, this ecosystem built right as well. The other thing about when you get your architecture set up properly, that's where you can really start to get the power of this compound improvement. And so there's a little loop that we've got here I'm going to run through very quickly. So the AI does the work. It's built from your current context. We've seen that. It sends the output. And let's say you've been through a review. You publish it. Great. And then away you go. The maintenance architecture in this little blue box down here, there's kind of three skills that I use on a not even a daily basis, like multiple times a day that I will run. Sorry, not the weekly review, obviously, but debrief and reflect are two skills that I run after each session. And so a session with the AI is like we got to a point, there's an outcome, great. It might have been back and forth, we might have been brainstorming some things, but at the end, I'll run a skill called debrief. And debrief has a look at that conversation, that session, if you like, and it says, right, here's all the things that we made, here's all the things that we agreed. I'm going to update my files. If you remember back to that first diagram we looked at that had project files, it may have some tasks. So if any task came out of it, it'll get added to the tasks file. It will update the Claude MD file. It will update the current status. It will add, if we created a marketing plan, it will add that to the project file. So everything is captured in there. So they're all the things that we created. Anything that was changed, it might have been updates, it created. That's what debrief does. And so now this becomes a living repository that just continues to update. The next one, reflect, is super important to get the compounding improvements. So reflect takes a look at if we ran any skills. And let's say it was the example that we used about creating a proposal. If in that process, when we created the proposal, I gave some feedback to the AI. I said, hey, that's shit, that's AI slop, I would never say that, don't do that, I hate that color, don't do those kind of diagrams, whatever it is, then Reflect will have a look at that feedback and then think about how that applies to the proposal generation skill. And it will update that and it will change that to make sure that next time we next time we do a run with this skill or this process, this workflow, it improves. It starts to get better. And so that's when you start to see things like, when I first started using AI to help out with writing LinkedIn, if you're here, you've probably seen me on LinkedIn. I tend to publish a lot, but I wrote a LinkedIn article and I tracked how many revisions I needed to do. And the answer was 65. So I needed 65 revisions to a LinkedIn article. So nothing, it's LinkedIn, it's not that serious, right? But I needed to make 65 changes to this document before it was good enough to go out. Now, 12 months later, 2 or 3. Because every time I go through this process and I give it feedback and I make these changes, then it's storing that knowledge and it's getting better and smarter and operating closer to where I want it to be. And that's, this reflect will only capture feedback that I've given within this session, like I've told AI. If you get impatient or you'd rather just do it yourself and you want to, it's written you a draft and then you think, I'll just go in there and make these changes directly because that's easier, that's totally fine. All you need to do is tell the machine, hey, I made some changes. go and have a look at what the final version that I sent and consider how to get that right next time. I do that quite a lot with emails as well. It'll write the draft for me. I don't want to talk to it and get it to redo a draft, so I'll just make changes. But I'll always say, hey, go and check what was actually sent, compare it to what you wrote, and then see what the difference is and see what we learned. One of the other really important pieces of your architecture are guardrails. So it's very important to tell not just the AI what to do, but also tell it what not to do. And this can be things like what good work looks like. You cannot have enough examples of what good looks like. Here's all of my sales proposals. If there's any really bad ones in there, maybe I'll leave those out. I'm just kidding. I'm sure you'll never have any bad examples. But, here's all the writing that I've done. Here's all my social media posts, whatever that looks like. Rules, standards, templates, things like that are very, very useful. So the output that it produces gets closer to that final product. It's also really important there to tell it what not to do. So, for example, I was building a proposal and my AI built a PowerPoint. I was like, what? PowerPoint? No. Never make a PowerPoint. I'm never using PowerPoint again until the day that I die, inshallah. So we do it in HTML. That's how we roll. So it went back and said, yep, okay, update memory. I'll do a presentation in HTML, and we go that way. Technical access. If you are taking the kind of minimum viable approach to your architecture in the sense that, you're using your existing kind of information systems, your existing ecosystem. So you're using Google Drive, for example. If you have permissions scoped via Google, which means you can access some folders but not others, some you can read, some you can write to, then those permissions will flow through to your agent, to your AI. So that's a really good way to have scoped credentials without going, the next layer up from there is building that expressly into the kind of agent that you're building. So the easiest way is that it just inherits the existing kind of scoped credentials that your current setup currently has. And then the last one is human approval. I almost made a very definitive statement in that my AI never sends anything out to the world without me looking at it. That's 99% true. There is very little that I will allow the agent to send out to the world without me having a look at it. Certainly anything kind of client-facing. Some marketing work I will let it do. No shade on marketers, by the way. Just because, it's generally, hey, there's a webinar on, come and jump in. There's less danger of that going astray. I had one instance where the AI went off the reservation and sent a email that I didn't want it to do. And the reason that it did that is I said, draft me an email. It drafted the email. It was just showing me kind of in the app. And then I read through it and said, oh, that's fine, yeah, I'll go and change that later. You can find his email in the calendar. So I went and found his email in the calendar. What I hadn't seen right down the very bottom after the draft in that message was the machine had said to me, give me their email and I'll send it off. And I didn't see that. And I was like, okay, let's work on that draft. About half an hour later, I said, oh, it's already sent. I was like, what? So technically, it viewed that as express permission, but that's the only time. The email wasn't too bad, but you don't want it doing things without explicit permission. Okay, so, good architecture enables this process where, your AI, when you give it a task, it starts briefed, it has all the current information, it knows where to find things, it knows how to shape the brief, it knows how to shape the output, and it leaves very clear handoffs. That's the outcome of when you get your architecture right and everything is humming and the machine is going well. Okay, I'll do a quick pause there for questions. Okay, Taz, thank you, Taz, for jumping in and sending a message. If you've got any questions, I'll pop this up. If you've got any questions, please throw them in the chat at this point. Otherwise, I will keep rolling on. Okay, so a little bit of homework for you if there aren't any questions there. A little bit of homework to think about with your architecture. One of the most useful ways that I've found of kind of mapping that out A question from Taz: where are you building the brain, offline or on? So I do have a session coming up on the brain in, I think it's next one is context, the one after that will be brain. The brain, the easiest way to think about the brain is it just needs to sit in a shared repository. If this is a brain that multiple people are accessing, then it needs to sit somewhere that multiple people can access it. At the moment, my brain is predominantly made up of, not this one, my AI brain is predominantly made up of Markdown, raw Markdown and HTML files. And it sits across iCloud, so just in my local documents, Google Drive, some shared drives, and some things live in GitHub as well. So it's actually living in multiple different places. The next evolution from there would be to build a dedicated database. If you've seen setups like GBrain, Gary Tan's brain that he's been building out, that's where it lives. So in terms of offline, I've got access to it offline. If I had local intelligence, I could run that way because it mostly all sits in my files. Thanks, Daz. Okay, so take home homework for you is to map the work before you automate it. And really the easiest way to go about this is to map it on paper. Like, where does it start? Where does a job start? Does it start when somebody sends you a signed contract and then you have to start delivering if you're in that space of the business? What information do you need? If somebody sends you that signed contract, do you need to know the history? Does it have pricing in it? Where do you go to find that out? Do you go to the CRM to pull the kind of previous history to see what the salespeople has promised? Because quite often, no shade, the salespeople will promise something that doesn't exist. So you need to make sure that hasn't happened, or at least trying to make it so if it has. If you're then building something, where does that go? One of our clients at Works is a custom home builder. And when a signed client comes in and they're ready to kick off the build, there's literally 18 different forms that they have to fill out based on the information in the contract and the brief that comes in. So where does that output go? And where does human approval have to come in? What can the machine do? And what do humans need to check and sign off on before they do? Okay, so if there's no more questions from the floor, thanks, Taz. Any more questions from you? Or anyone else? If you need some help turning the messy reality of your existing business into this AI operating layer, that's what we do at Works. We embed inside your company. We map the work as it rolls through your business from start to finish. We help you build this architecture. We help you build the brain. And then we start to build some custom workflows based on exactly what your business does and how it operates. So give me a call. I will be sharing a copy of this webinar today. Hopefully there were no technical difficulties joining in. Thanks, team. Thanks for playing. Appreciate you coming along. And look out for the next in the series, which will be context and how to build the smallest useful slice for your machine so that it's ready to roll.